Thank you, Sherry. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be here on such an auspicious anniversary. And I think my awakening in terms of my political philosophy really started a long time ago. I was raised in a Republican household. I was fed a steady diet of Rush Limbaugh and the National Review growing up. And we always just thought we were conservative. And conservative was always a good word around the house. And you wanted to be conservative and you wanted to vote Republican. And you didn't really think a whole lot about what that meant. But gradually over time, I began to realize something. I began to realize that I've been voting for conservatives my entire life. Yet, over my entire life, all the government was doing at every single level was just still getting bigger. And it didn't even matter who was in office. Even when I was electing and we were being served by so-called conservatives, the government still kept getting bigger. And I began to do a little bit more digging and wondering, maybe someone's playing a cosmic joke on me. What's going on? And I started to do just a little bit of reading, a little bit of history, and I started to realize that, wait a minute, this isn't the first time we've had these sorts of issues. And I began to realize that oftentimes when the government wants to confuse us, they kind of change language around. And then I ran into this guy, George Orwell, who did a really good job of explaining how government likes to communicate. And that was really instructive. So you just get on the path of reading and asking questions and exploring, and eventually get to the point where you begin to realize, aha, we have been here before. The names have changed, the dates have changed, but the patterns are exactly identical. And if we can recognize today and the threats we face as a country for what they are, and put them into the right historical context, we can avoid being confused and distracted and otherwise defocused from what we should be trying to do, which is bringing our country and our world to a point where we have something to leave to our children, as opposed to the direction we're going, which is clearly not. And I think the real wake-up call for me was understanding that when Thomas Jefferson was participating and helping to organize the birth of our nation through the authoring of the Declaration of Independence and the process of advocating for the throwing off the yoke of British tyranny, the same forces that were seeking to consolidate power in Washington, in Washington today, they still existed back in Jefferson's time. They just had a different name. It was the Hamiltonians, the Hamiltonian Federalists. And it was the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans who were fighting the battle of an overwhelming central government that would do what it wanted in the so-called national interest versus the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans who really did believe that the philosophy upon which our government was founded was for the guarantee of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, ultimately, as we've come to finally appreciate, for every American individual. And I can honestly say as an American that we are not perfect. We've never been perfect. We've never lived up to the ideals of Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. But we've made a lot of progress in many fronts. And it doesn't take too much study of history to realize that we've let ourselves become distracted, because at this point we're not really recognizing the enemy for what the enemy is. And I think it's instructive to consider that what we're going through today, if you want to know where we're going, you have to look at where we've been. So the battle that Jefferson was fighting at the time as an advocate for a limited federal government, for control of money and the economy in the hands of the people. He advocated very strongly against the consolidation of credit in the hands of a central bank, which was a Hamiltonian position. He wanted democratization of capital. He wanted people to enjoy the fruits of their labor. All of those are common themes. And that is the philosophy of liberty at work. The philosophy of tyranny at work, it can sound kind of well-meaning. People can use nice words like the national interest, or we want to do things that are for the good of the country. But in the process, what you do is you put corporate interests or special interests over the rights and the privileges of the individual. So we use the word conservative today and somehow think that has to do with small government. Unfortunately, conservative, if it's applied in the generic context today, what kind of conservatives are we generally talking about? Neoconservatives, right? And here's where things get really, really tricky, because the same battle that was being fought just in terms of nomenclature and naming things is being fought today when we talk about conservatives. Conservatives in the neoconservative strike, they're not actually interested in small government, right? And the godfather of neoconservative is this guy named Irving Kristol. And when you begin to study the history of the conservative movement in the 20th century, you begin to realize that, well, Irving Kristol did not come from a Jeffersonian Democratic Republican individual liberty perspective. No, he actually grew up in the 30s and the 40s as a radical socialist. Here's someone who saw government as a tool to be used to advance a particular social and economic agenda. And he and his buddies then ended up infecting, essentially, I don't think that's too harsh a word, infecting the Republican Party with this idea of neoconservatives that would use the power of the state to advance specific economic interests. So when you think about the rap that the Republican Party has, in many cases rightfully so, we're the party of big business, right? What's another word for big business and supporting big business? Is corporate welfare. So you've got a choice, right? As Democrats are in favor of social programs and individual welfare. Republicans, conservatives, have supposedly become the party of big business and corporate welfare. Well, yeah, that's kind of true. And the American public, we're suffering under a false choice. So the people that I most admire today, and the people that I am pleased and proud to be associated with, are the folks in this room, the folks who understand that the true roots of liberty are the Jeffersonian view, the classical liberal view, that ultimately gets down to what I believe to be a fantastic framework for running any country, and that's the golden rule. When you talk about what it means to have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, at the end of the day, in my mind, that comes very, very close to a government that upholds, or as close as you can come to a government who upholds the ultimate tradition morally for me, which is do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. And that was my experience. It was the experience of virtuous capitalism where you grow a business by taking really good care of your customers. Not because you pay your lobbyists a lot of money and get special favors. So when you start looking at the way the world works today, we absolutely have to take control of the dialogue. And we have to advance the dialogue to the point that people understand that conservative versus liberal, or Democrat versus Republican, these are just words that are used to distract us. And they're words that are going to be used to destroy our country. Because while we're beating each other up for being Democrats or Republicans or liberals or conservatives, both party establishments are marching to the exact same drum. And that drum is about the relentless consolidation of power in the pursuit of more and more control over our economy, over our educational system, over our healthcare system, over our natural resources, everything that we can and should be using to build a free, prosperous world for our children. And it affects our domestic policy, it affects our foreign policy, and Todd made a great point about the fallacy of foreign aid. Here we are borrowing money that we don't have to give to other nations, and in many cases the money that we give in foreign aid, it never even leaves the country. It's simply given to a United States-based contractor to go do public works and other things of maybe even potential less social value in other countries. It's more corporate welfare. Should we be helping other countries around the world? Absolutely. I've got a good friend, we got a good friend who was actually he was actually on the streets of Harare, Zimbabwe, where he was picked up by a missionary when he was a child off the streets. He was educated here in the United States and now runs a mission in Zimbabwe. That's the kind of help that we as free American citizens can and should be doing. That's a foreign policy that we can believe in. Is a foreign policy that succeeds based upon offering trade and economic development through consensual exchange and helping other countries build their own nations. Being beacons of liberty, beacons on the hill. So for me, the Jeffersonian ideal is something that really cuts to the heart of what the struggle in our nation is about today. It's about freedom versus tyranny. It's not versus liberals or Democrats or conservatives versus Republicans. Any of their labels that they'll throw on us, it all comes down to liberty versus tyranny. Where do you stand? And when we frame the dialogue in that light, and when we hold our party leadership accountable and say, why should I be trusting you to make the right decision based upon words when you clearly don't even have a framework that you can articulate for showing how you're going to live up to the basic tenets of our founding documents, the ideals of our Declaration of Independence, a constitution-limited federal government. Those are the kind of discussions that we need to and should be happening.